Welcome to Cities on the Move. I'm your host, Stephanie Passingham. Local law enforcement is often something we take for granted unless something unusual happens. Today we get a special tour of the new Mower County Jail. Sheriff Therese Amazai describes its features and what needs the new facility addresses. We also talk to area law enforcement leaders about local government aid. Recent cuts to the state's revenue balancing effort have had significant impacts on local government. We'll find out if and how law enforcement is being affected. We'll have all this and more. Stay tuned for Cities on the Move. We recently sat down with Mower County Sheriff Therese Amazai to get a closer view of the new Mower County Jail. Let's take a look. 87 jail facilities throughout Minnesota can incarcerate 8,000 inmates at any given time. With the opening of the new jail, the capacity for Mower County will increase from 32 to 128. While Minnesota has less crime than the national average, improving public safety and the safety of the jail system is an ongoing effort. The development of the Mower County Jail began more than 10 years ago. Recently, Mower County Sheriff Therese Amazai sat down with us to describe the new facility. We are today sitting in a brand new facility.
That's correct.
Tell us about some of the needs, and space is clearly one of them, but tell us about some of the needs that were identified and when that conversation started taking place.
Actually, those conversations started taking place with Sheriff Barry Simonson, and that was about 12 years ago that they had a national corrections company come in and take a look and do a study on what they believed our needs would be currently and then into the future. And there was definitely insufficient space in our current facility even back then. And things have only gotten worse since that time.
All right. Describe for us, please, the current facilities, what you had before. I believe it was built in the 1960s?
It was built in 1965, actually. That's when completion was accomplished, and inmates were moved in. At that time, it was licensed to hold 72 inmates. And throughout the years and through Department of Corrections mandates, those beds have been cut to an operational capacity, and that's kind of their current buzzwords, to 32 beds. So we can only hold 32 inmates, and that's for classification purposes throughout the jail. And we just have too many inmates. Currently, on any given day, we're running between 60 to 75 inmates, and that's pretty much average. And so, we were having to look for other facilities to house our inmates in. This facility will hold, at maximum capacity, 128 inmates.
And you were talking about classification. Help us understand what that means.
Classification of inmates is, you don't put males and females together. You don't put males that have mental health issues in with, normal population of prisoners. We don't typically put those that have committed homicide or murder in with any other inmates. They're their own special class. We also have a lot of behavioral issues that we need to separate and segregate. And there's just many things that go into their criminal behavior on the outside, what their charges are on the inside, those kinds of things that we need to separate.
While previously, Mower County relied on other jails in the region to house their excess prisoner population, with the new facility, they are now in a position to help other jails.
Back about 3 years ago, Department of Corrections made us a 90-day lockup, which had a tremendous impact on our jail population, and that we had to ship them out, and we became day counters. They could only be here so many days, then they had to go to another facility. This is actually booking. So it became necessary for daily transports, and people said, well, just ship out the ones that are sentenced. It doesn't work that way. Okay. We have too many inmates of every different kinds. And court dates are out so far. Some trials take a year for those things to be accomplished.
And you have to house them that entire time?
Yes, that we can't house them locally. They have to go to another facility.
Is there a typical, if you had to average it out, how long does someone typically stay?
A typical stay, there really isn't, you know, because we have so many different crimes that people get held for. And, you know, people think, well, we only have drunk drivers in jail. Not so. There's a lot more serious offenders, and we've seen that trend increase. Serious offenders definitely pose a greater responsibility in the jail because they are here for so long.
All right. So when you had to ship them out, as you described before, where did they go, and did they ultimately end up having to come back to court here?
Yes, they always had to come back for court here. Court hearings, release. We were responsible for releasing them. But, you know, at any given time, we had them in Osage, Iowa. We had them in Freeborn County. We had them in Steele County, and we also used Goodhue County on occasion. Currently today we're just using Steele County Jail for our second facility.
Okay. With the new facility, do you anticipate being able to offer that option to other facilities that I'm sure are facing the same issues that you did?
And actually it's a fairly new facility, Freeborn County. I did talk with their sheriff, and although not willing to commit at this time, you know, female space, and that's the cell pod that there was some discussion over whether they were going to open it or not, really is at a premium. And Freeborn County's female space is full because they have an ICE contract. So I did speak with that sheriff, and certainly there is some talk going about there. But also we've had interest from Department of Corrections because they have a space with their prison population as well. So those are all issues that we will be looking at.
All right. And for the uninitiated, tell us what ICE means.
Immigration Customs Enforcement. So that would be, you know, the people that need to be held for extradition back to their home country.
One of the key features of the new Jail and Justice Center involves the movement of prisoners to and from court. This jail is also in the same building as the courts.
Correct.
Tell us a little bit about how perhaps the movement of prisoners and other individuals visiting the courts are going to be different now.
Right. Our old facility, you know, we would bring inmates in the back hallway, but that back hallway was also occupied by jury, by judges, as well as court administration staff and law clerks and those kinds of things. So it was not uncommon that a judge would come out of his courtroom in the line of a row of prisoners. So that was not uncommon at all. We also had to have like a code system when we had an active jury, so that we weren't bringing inmates past the jury. They would have to be in their chambers, and then, you know, we would move the inmates to and from. With this facility, that's not the case. There's actually three, not hallways, but three separate areas. One is for the public. The second is for the judges, the court administration staff, and other staff for that court purpose. And then the third is for the inmates. The back hallway here at the jail is actually a direct line into a court holding facility, very similar to what you see here with jail cells, where the inmates go, they get held for their prospective court appearances, and it's right between the two main courtrooms.
Control of inmates is key to the safety of everyone involved in the system. You've described a little bit, you've alluded to kind of the cell block format, but give us a sense of how many blocks there are, how many prisoners are housed in each block, and you seem to have some kind of master control centers along the way.
It's absolutely called master control.
Okay.
We actually have three separate cell blocks. The current one that we're in right now is general population, and that is all males. We can hold up to 48 inmates in this cell block area. And this is where, you know, we don't have the need to separate and segregate inmates as much as our male special management cell. And that is a cell block in and of itself, and it's divided into several separate areas. And that is for separating inmates according to their criminal activity, as well as, you know, their behavior modification needs. Once they get behind these walls, it doesn't always mean that they're going to behave. So we have to have the ability to separate them from other inmates, you know, certainly assaultive behavior. We can't have people beating up other inmates, you know, those kinds of things, so that we have to have separate areas to put them in. And then we also have female. And female, you know, it would be good to have a general population there, but we have to set it up as a special management cell because you don't have enough females to take up a whole cell block, typically. And so we have that divided into separate sections as well. One is for work release, because we do have females that have jobs and get out of jail for work release. We also have the behavioral issues with the female population, and we also have general population, and all those things take place in one cell block. So.
You were describing to me earlier, and you just mentioned it as well, that they don't automatically change to good behavior when they come inside. Can we talk about the corridors that you have that help you control their environment?
Right, and you know, everything is controlled by the one jailer that's in this cell block. And you know, we can also make it as difficult on these people as possible when they're in jail. We must give them 1 hour of activity outside of their cell. So they can take a shower, they can do their daily business, those kinds of things. But some of them may be locked up for 23 hours out of 24. But we need to have the ability to separate them as well from the other individuals that do behave once they're in custody.
You mentioned recreation facilities. Some folks will say, well, you're in jail, you shouldn't have a chance
to you know, and I'm of that school. You know, they shouldn't get anything that they wouldn't normally get on the outside, and they shouldn't have it any better than anybody else. But those are the things that are mandated by Department of Corrections.
And what's the reason for that?
It's actually a tool. And it's a tool for our jail staff so that, you know, they can monitor these individuals. It's a corrective measure. All right, you've acted up today, you're not going to get exercise. It's things that we can take away. And it's about giving and the ability to take it away. And it's about behavior modification. Just about everything we do in this jail is about behavior modification. Everything that we give can be taken away.
The new jail will mean changes for staff as well as prisoners. Let's talk technology, surveillance of prisoners, opening and closing of doors. What has changed in the last 25 years?
Everything. You know, today's typical jail is not about keys. Our old jail is about keys. We all carried keys. This is all electronic. It's all surveilled with cameras and equipped with you know, the video to monitor and play back, and you know, and a lot of sound issues that we don't have in our current facility. All those things are taped. They can be used later, and we also have video visiting, where you know, people from the public come into a room where there's no intermingling with inmates anymore. You know, there's no direct contact, even through glass. It's all done via video link, and those are also in these cell blocks that we'll take a look at. So it really limits anybody, one, coming into the jail. They're out on the perimeter, they're not in the secure facility, but it also limits inmate movement. And when you come into inmate movement, it's about people, because we have to have staff when we're moving inmates. And the more we could limit inmate movement, the less staff that are needed. That staff member supervises everything that takes place in that cell block.
So will the new facility, it's larger, you can accommodate more people. Will you see a staffing change?
We actually did have to hire more staff because, you know, currently we operate at 32 inmates. Well, when we operate this facility, we can go up to 128. Certainly not initially, but right away, you know, we're able to hold 88 inmates right away from the opening. So that does take additional staff. And Department of Corrections also mandates that they approve your staffing plan. So if you don't have enough staff on board, they will not let you open.
One significant change to the facility was in medical treatment of prisoners. What do you do if someone comes into the jail and has a medical condition, or maybe comes into the jail not in the greatest of condition?
Right, and you know, many of these people aren't in the best condition. They don't take care of themselves. You know, they drink, they do drugs, they smoke excessively. You know, they're not in the best health, and we're required to do medical care. And now we have contracted with a correctional medical group. And you know, they buy back medications, and you know, they bring in portable x-ray units and those kinds of things to really try to do their best to limit the costs. So we're looking at saving there, substantial savings.
Certainly there was a large capital outlay to create the building, but are you able to see then in the operations any long-term savings?
Savings is a hard word to do because, you know, you've got inmates and you don't see savings, but any cost-saving measures that we can possibly do, we will implement. And that really boils down to talking to other jails, what they're doing, as well as any possibility of saving money anywhere we possibly can.
The Mower County Jail becomes fully operational in late 2010. Well, today we're going to talk a little bit about LGA, an acronym that many people hear, where we're going to learn what that means, and we're going to talk about it in context of local law enforcement and how these LGA cuts that are being discussed, and some that have already taken place, may have affected some of our regional communities. We have a great group of special guests today. I'd like to introduce Gary Carlson, who is the Director of Intergovernmental Relations for the League of Minnesota Cities. We have Chief Keith Hiller from the Waseca Police Department. We have Chief Roger Peterson from the Rochester Police Department, and we have Chief Dwayne Winkles from Albert Lee's Police Department. Thank you, all of you, for being here.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Gary, LGA, we hear that so often. What does it mean?
Well, local government aid was a program that was actually originally established in 1971, and at the time the state of Minnesota was experiencing a very high spike in property taxes, and the state legislature decided at that time that instead of relying so heavily on the property tax, that they would raise a sales tax and use some of that money to help fund cities, counties, and school districts. Local government aid was the program for cities, and currently that program provides about $500 million, $500 million of money to help cities perform all of their essential functions, including public safety.
Well, gentlemen, you represent cities of varying sizes, but certainly I think everyone would agree law enforcement is one of those essential services that Gary mentioned that LGA was supposed to help support for cities. Give us a sense of what's happened in your communities as a result of some of these LGA cuts.
You've trimmed everything you can. The city council looks at your budget, and because law enforcement represents such a large segment of the city budget, usually it's about a third or a little less, when you start having to trim, we had to cut $1.1 million in 2010. It impacts law enforcement. You cannot leave that large of a piece of the pie unscathed. So we laid off an officer last year. We did not rehire several that we lost through attrition. Going in the future, we're looking at downsizing again if this projected LGA cuts continue. So that's right off the bat for us. The city lost a lot of services because personnel equals services. So now the hard dollar's got to be decided. Where else are you going to cut? Do you give up your pool? Do you give up your ice rink? Do you give up your libraries? Cities that are like Albert Lee that are economically depressed, that don't have the tax base, do get a little bit more LGA. So the state is saying because you're a depressed area, you don't get the same services. So therefore, we're going to cut your funding. So you don't get a library, you don't get a pool, you don't get an ice rink. That's the message that's being sent.
All right.
We've, for lack of a better term, we've been pretty blessed. The city of Waseca, the city council, has made law enforcement a core service. However, the employees have noticed some significant reductions, whether it be no increases, whether it be significant modifications to health insurance, where we have high deductibles. In addition to that, we look for creative ways for technology and equipment, whether it be through grants or donations or partnerships with our local businesses. Unfortunately, I think we're getting to a tipping point where we've made scheduling adjustments, modified overtime, looked at training on a large scale, and we're at a point right now, if the cuts continue, that obviously it's going to affect personnel, and then anytime you're in a large service-based industry that deals with human resources, being people, we're going to have some significant cuts in service, and that's really what we're afraid of at this point.
All right. How about in Rochester?
Well, I think as we talk about those cuts in service, that's really at the center of the issue. Rochester, as far as the police department is concerned, we've been able to avoid layoffs, but we're holding positions vacant that we currently filled. Most of our efficiencies that we gained in the past, that is the civilianization of some certain positions that we can do more efficiently, those are the ones that take the greatest hit when your budgets are cut because people want to see police officers on the street. that we're trying hard to accomplish, but it's making us much less efficient, because what we're sacrificing in doing that is that efficiency that you gain with, for instance, specialized positions that may be civilian position, crime analyst position, civilians to respond to non-emergency calls, et cetera. And those are all the ones that the publicly, the political will is there, will sacrifice those in order to preserve the police officer position. So what that makes us is a lot less efficient, and we're spending more money trying to do the same work. That's really mortgaging a future for us. We need to, particularly with Rochester being one of the largest or fastest growing communities in the state, we're not keeping pace with our population growth as far as staffing issues are concerned.
Okay.
That may not be the immediate concern to our citizens as much as it will be 2 or 3 or 5 years from now, because there's no effective way to catch up. Once you fall behind, it takes such a huge outlay in capital. We can keep pace with hiring maybe 2 or 3 people in a year, but when you forgo that, and we've been in crisis mode since 2003 when the first unallotments occurred, once you keep in crisis mode that long, you're talking about hiring 10, 12, 18 to catch up, and that's just not in anybody's reality. So that's a real problem for the future.
Policy. All right. Do you find extra challenges when the economy is in a downturn or in a depressed state, and it's causing some of these budget crunches? Does that at all impact the amount of crime that takes place in the communities? And so do you find yourself with less funds having to deal with more crime, or is that not as much of an issue?
Well, I can speak for us. We've been very fortunate. I think that some of the trends, or some of the predictions, was we would see an increase in crime. We've seen about an 18% reduction in Part 1 and Part 2 crimes. However, when we talk about services to the community, I think the average citizen expects, if they're a victim of a robbery or a homicide or something significant, they're going to get police services. When I talk about reduction in services, I'm talking about what people expect. We speak of community-based policing, community-oriented policing, where they call on that habitual barking dog that's bothering them, or their tires were slashed on their car, or that fingerprinting clinic where they're engaging and establishing a relationship with law enforcement personnel. They've come to expect them on an everyday basis. And all of a sudden, when you don't give that funeral escort, or they get a packet in the mail for their vehicle being damaged, that's when they really start to see, well, what am I actually paying for? I'm missing them services, and that's what we don't want to see happen.
Yeah, we have not noticed an increase in crime due to the downturn, which, like most communities, I think, didn't experience it nationwide. I don't know how Rochester's been.
Yeah, we've been fortunate. We would reflect the same type of numbers as far as crime rates concerned. Our concern, though, is that as we talk about this delivery of services, is people have a tendency to look at, as you mentioned earlier, well, public safety is separate. We'll prioritize that differently. We'll hold that harmless in these budget cuts. And that assumes that your best crime prevention tools are actually the enforcement end of that. It's not. The real prevention takes place in that social, educational, recreational, cultural, all those things that cities do to enhance the quality of life in a given community. That really, that's what is at the heart of crime prevention. When you sacrifice those programs for enforcement because you're going to preserve the enforcement end of it, I will guarantee you, you'll have a lot more enforcement to do. And that's what as we look at the trends across the country, particularly as my colleagues know, crime rates have a tendency to start on the coast and work their way in, and that's the tidal wave that we're waiting for in the future as we look at the trends, particularly in the larger cities, particularly violent crime issues. We're looking at not a result of a lack of enforcement. We're looking at a lack of, really back in 2003 when this ball started rolling, was as those programs got cut, we were dealing with the prevention end. We're dealing with 10 or 12-year-old kids that we have mitigation and intervention and recognizing at-risk youth and what their needs are.
Getting ahead of the game.
And who suffered during those years. It was those programs. What happens now that they're 18 and 20 years old? And that's what our concern is.
What happened with you, we lost our civilian personnel, key component to our crime prevention. We were looking at cutting our school officers. they're a huge asset to us to have those officers in the school and we're interacting with kids. When we transformed here 4 or 5 years ago to a community-oriented policing, it's all about preventative interaction with the community, getting the community involved with the officers. We deliver more services today than we ever have in our history. Right. And just when you see the corner being turned, now it's going to be taken out. Those things that made it get to this point are going to be taken out from underneath you.
Gary, look in your crystal ball and tell us about LGA and its future. Do these guys have more things to be concerned about, or is this a temporary hurt?
Well, the state is still projected to be facing a 5.8, nearly a $6 billion deficit for the upcoming biennium. And when the legislature convenes in January, they're going to have to begin discussing how they're going to solve that deficit. And as we've been talking with legislators and candidates across the state and talking with the gubernatorial candidates, there are going to be no easy solutions to the state budget crisis. And it's pretty clear that anybody that is a recipient of state appropriations is going to have to keep an eye out for additional cuts in the future, and these could be severe.
May not be over yet.
Yeah.
For folks watching at home, if you have any questions or concerns about law enforcement in your community, be sure to visit with your local elected officials and also be communicating with your members of the legislature to share your thoughts on this subject as well. Thank you, gentlemen, for sharing the perspective from your community. Appreciate the information. Thank you, Gary, for coming down.
Thank you.
Stay tuned for more Cities on the Move. Next week on Cities on the Move, we check out Mantorville, Minnesota. We learn about brewing beer, making chocolates, and addressing hazards. Please join us Tuesday, October 12th at 6:30 p.m. on KSMQ for another edition of Cities on the Move. I'm your host, Stephanie Passingham. Good night.